When Adolf Hitler led the German nation into the most terrible war humanity had ever seen, a conflict that would result in an unthinkable loss of life, spreading far into the east and penetrating beyond the borders of the West, few would have believed such a meteoric rise to global dominance by any nation was possible. United with fascist Italy and Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany would form an axis of evil to battle against the Allied forces of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, France and later Russia, followed by America. Waging relentlessly for 6 long years from 1939 to 1945, the Second World War claimed in excess of 50 million lives. And the question of how Austrian-born Adolf Hitler, once a destitute artist living on the streets of Vienna, inspired generals, politicians and the German people themselves to embark upon a catastrophic journey that would alter the course of history, has never been fully explained. Not all Germans supported Adolf Hitler, and many risked their lives to shatter his cruel regime. But equally, there were also those who were as dangerous as the Führer himself, and as vital to the foundation of the Third Reich. Joseph Goebbels, the brilliant propagandist, faithful to Hitler to the very end. Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the deadly SS, who oversaw the extermination of millions of Jews. And Hermann Göring, who was at the Führer's side from the beginning of his rise to power, are just a few of the protagonists that'll be featured as we consider Adolf Hitler and the Germans at war. But before we step back in time to explore the dramatic events of the Second World War, we should travel even further back, to the 19th century and rural Austria, where farmer's daughter Maria Anna Schicklgruber gave birth to an illegitimate son. Maria was Hitler's grandmother, and when she later married a man called Heidler, he gave his name to her son, Adolf's father, Alois, which in turn was changed to Hitler. There's no clear evidence who Hitler's grandfather was, but Maria's relationship with her Jewish employer's son may well have had a dreadful irony, suggesting that the man who persecuted the Jews so vehemently may in actual fact have been part Jewish in his ancestry. Despite the humiliation of his illegitimacy, Alois Hitler was determined to make his way in the world, and by the time he married his second wife, Clara, in 1885, he had a successful career working as a customs official. Clara was in fact Alois' niece, and a papal dispensation had to be sought to allow the marriage. And long after they were married, Clara continued to call her husband uncle. The couple lost their first 3 children to diphtheria, but in 1889 they were blessed with a healthy baby boy, who they named Adolf, meaning noble wolf. 5 years later, another son, Edmund, was born, and then a daughter, Paula. As the children grew, a strong bond formed between Adolf and his mother, but his relationship with his father was far from affectionate, and he received plenty of beatings from the domineering Alois. Young Adolf was the apple of his mother's eye, and a creative though lazy boy who found it difficult to socialize with others. He was determined to become an artist, and in 1907 sat the entrance exam for the Academy of Fine Arts in Austria's capital, Vienna, but failed to impress. When he returned home to Braunau am Inn, there was little to console him, as the family doctor had diagnosed Clara with cancer, giving her only months to live. Adolf was devastated and did everything he could to care for his mother, tending to her every need and begging the doctor to relieve her pain. But just days before Christmas, on December the 21st, 1907, Clara died, and Adolf lost the only person who he'd ever loved. Distraught with grief, Adolf left Braunau am Inn after Clara's death and returned to Vienna, using money that had been left to him to live in relative comfort, only streets away from the Hofburg Palace, where the Austrian politicians planned the future of the empire. Enjoying life in the glorious city, Hitler was a regular visitor to the opera house, being particularly fond of Wagner, and he continued to study art, determined to fulfill his dream of becoming a painter. But such aspirations were beyond his grasp. When he sat the exams a second time, he fared even worse than he had on his first attempt. Hitler fell into a deep depression, and haunted by the memory of his dying mother, the tortured 18-year-old's life seemed to simply collapse around him. The pathetically bedraggled figure that roamed the streets and alleys of Vienna was almost unrecognisable as the young man who'd previously dressed so immaculately. Now penniless, Hitler was utterly alone, and as he sought someone to blame, it was in this dark period that he began to meet others living in poverty who blamed the Jews for their predicament. Anti-Semitism was not a new ideology for the Austrians, and Hitler hungrily consumed political articles and speeches that gave him a reason to hate. Spurred on by anger and a little financial help from his half-sister, Hitler began to recover himself, and even earned a little money from his painting, but without warning, his entire world, and that of millions of Europeans, suddenly changed. On June the 28th, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Bosnian Serb, a member of the Black Hand Gang, and the retaliation of the Empire against the tiny Serbian kingdom triggered a series of alliances which propelled the world into war. Britain, France, Russia, and later America, amongst others, would form the Entente Powers, which now confronted the Central Powers of Austro-Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. The all too familiar images of vast tracts of muddy trenches that characterise World War I, where so many soldiers struggled and died, makes it all the more extraordinary today that when war was first declared nearly a century ago, it was celebrated with great exuberance. Soldiers readily enlisted on all sides to fight for king and country, convinced that they'd be home within months. Hitler was among those joyfully celebrating, and later wrote, "To me, those hours seemed like a release from the painful feelings of my youth. I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart. A fight for freedom had begun." But although Hitler was quick to enlist, it was not in the Austrian army. He'd left Austria for Munich in 1913 and asked permission to join the Bavarian army to fight for Germany. It seems the misery of Hitler's life in Austria and the prospect of fighting alongside Czechs and Jews had driven him from the nation of his birth, and when he was called upon for conscription into the Austro-Hungarian army, he was safely on German soil. Now aged 25, Hitler travelled to the front on October the 21st, 1914. However, Kaiser Wilhelm's promises that the soldiers would be home before the autumn leaves had fallen from the trees proved to be wildly inaccurate, and it was soon obvious that this terrible conflict was nothing to celebrate. In a letter, Hitler described lying huddled together with his fellow soldiers as a terrible shindig began in the distance, as the shell bursts came so thick and fast they merged into one continuous roar. Despite these shocking conditions, Hitler would prove his worth as a soldier, and was even awarded the Iron Cross for his efforts. But after 4 years of fighting for his country, he was only promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal, because his superiors, ironically, were convinced that he lacked the ability to lead others. During those dreadful war years, Hitler miraculously escaped death many times, and one day, as he limped within the range of a British soldier, the fate of millions may have taken a very different turn. But Private Henry Tandy, pitying the thin, injured soldier, didn't pull the trigger, and 2 decades later, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, on a mission to forge peace with Germany, would be astounded to find a photograph of Tandy at Hitler's Berghof villa. Chamberlain was quick to inform the soldier, by then the most decorated private in the British Army, who he'd saved with his merciful act, and as Tandy took shelter as Coventry was decimated by a Nazi bombing raid in 1940, he no doubt deeply regretted his compassionate act. This was just one of Hitler's many extraordinary escapes, but just months before the war ended, he became a victim of a gas attack in August 1918. He stumbled off the battlefield, seized with pain, and later recalled how a few hours later his eyes had turned into glowing coals, and everything had grown dark. Hitler had been blinded. It was only a matter of months, as Hitler still lay recovering in a military hospital, that Germany surrendered, as the Entente powers were victorious. On November the 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest in France. And the outcome of the First World War couldn't have been more disastrous for the proud German nation. There'd been 6 million German casualties, and a year later, at the Palace of Versailles, the leaders of the Entente powers stripped Germany of valuable industrial land, all of its overseas colonies, and perhaps worst of all, its pride. Hitler's adopted homeland had to take full responsibility for the war, pay huge reparations to the victors, and while the Kaiser abdicated as the country became a republic, Hitler later expressed the horror he'd felt on receiving the news that he'd fought in vain. There followed terrible days and even worse nights. I knew that all was lost. In these nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. Many speculate about what exactly happened to Hitler during his time in hospital, but it seems that when he eventually regained his sight, he'd become convinced that he'd been shown the way to restore German pride, and it was now his duty, and his alone, to save the nation from Marxism and capitalism. His passionate anti-Semitic feeling and oratory skills impressed the army, and when he finally left hospital, he was made an educational officer to lecture new recruits before becoming an undercover agent in 1919 to inform on Marxist uprisings in the increasingly unstable German cities. In the September of 1919, he was sent to investigate a small group in Munich known as the German Workers' Party. But rather than find fault with the organisation, their anti-Semitic ideology gripped Hitler, and he quickly joined them. Among the men within the party, Hitler would find many of the companions that would accompany him on his journey to ultimate power. One of them was Hermann Göring, who was as furious as Hitler by the defeat of Germany, feeling that the nation's politicians had stabbed their glorious army in the back by accepting the Treaty of Versailles. He also met Rudolf Hess, a young politics student who'd become devoted to Hitler after hearing him speak.
Die Gegner werfen uns Nationalsozialisten vor und mir insbesondere.
It didn't take long for the man that army officers had dismissed as incapable of leading to work his way up to become the Führer of the party, and by the time it had been renamed the Nazi Party, with the swastika established as the party symbol, the number of members had grown by thousands. Hitler now had his own private army of stormtroopers, commonly known as the Brown Shirts or the SA, whose aggressive violence would form a vital part of the Nazi Party's character. In 1923, along with his troops and accompanied by Göring and Hess, Hitler seized his chance to take on the German government in the famous Munich Beer Hall Putsch. At this early stage they were unsuccessful, however, and Hitler fled as national troops arrived on the scene. Both he and Hess were given jail sentences, while Göring recovered from the wounds he'd received, which would trouble him for the rest of his life. Once behind bars in Munich's Landsberg prison, Hitler didn't stop his quest for power, as the stream of feelings and anger he felt were written down by Hess to create Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The ideas in this book would form the blueprint for Nazi ideology. He discussed Jewish conspiracies and hailed the Aryans as the supreme race over the inferior Jews, Czechs, Poles and Russians. The Aryans were entitled to more living space, or Lebensraum, and this land would be acquired by force, beginning with France in the west to avenge Germany's defeat in World War I. Little attention was paid to the work at the time, but as life became harsher in the country within a few years, people began to take Hitler's radical ideas more seriously. On October the 29th, 1929, the Wall Street crash in America threw Europe into an economic depression, which had devastating consequences for Germany. Inflation rocketed, and as the economy froze, millions were made bankrupt. Verging on starvation, the desperate nation now soaked up the passionate speeches of Adolf Hitler as he offered them salvation and hope. Hitler had also added other important members to the party, who now stood by his side. Heinrich Himmler was a fanatical nationalist with a deep-set hatred of the Jews, and was appointed leader of Hitler's bodyguard, the SS, and later became commander of the Gestapo. This terror-fueled organisation was responsible for the administration of the dreaded concentration camps and the coordinated killing of millions of Jews, Poles and Communists, along with other ethnic groups, as well as imprisoning and torturing countless numbers of Germans. Another member of Hitler's Nazi Party was Joseph Goebbels, a talented propagandist who became crucial in gathering support for Hitler. Although Goebbels was rejected from the army because of his physical limitations due to a club foot, he was intellectually brilliant and prepared to do anything for his Führer, even when Hitler's policies went against his socialist principles. To him, Hitler was both great and simple at the same time, what one calls a genius. Goebbels waged a furious poster campaign in preparation for the election of 1932, as Hitler aimed to become leader of the country legally, and thousands of Nazi rallies were held all over Germany. He even made use of the latest technology making films, which could be distributed to the public. In the spring of 1932, with 6 million unemployed, starvation rife and Berlin in chaos, people now turned to Hitler in their millions, and Goebbels' posters and lavish events attracted more and more people to the Nazi ideology. However, as the election campaign was building momentum, another family tragedy hit the Führer hard. In 1929, his half-sister had moved to his Berchtesgaden villa to work as a housekeeper, bringing her daughter Geli with her. Hitler adored the young woman and would do anything for her, but was also insanely jealous, despite the fact that he was already embroiled in an affair with the 19-year-old Eva Braun. The pressure must have been immense on the 21-year-old Geli, who found herself a prisoner in her own home, and on September the 18th, 1931, she shot herself in the heart. Hitler was devastated, and official Nazi photographer Heinrich Hoffmann said that after her death, the seeds of inhumanity began to grow inside him. What's more, Geli wasn't the only woman Hitler was involved with who attempted to take her own life. Just a year later, Eva Braun, who was always kept from public view, tried to shoot herself in the neck. Unlike Geli, Eva survived, and her secret relationship with Hitler would continue right through until their deaths in 1945. By 1932, the presence of the SA, the Nazi stormtroopers, now led by Ernst Röhm, began to strike terror into the heart of the democratic government, and many believed the brown shirts, now reaching 400,000 in number, would take over Germany by force. Heinrich Brüning, the Chancellor of the German Republic, attempted to stand up to Hitler and the Nazis by banning the SA and SS, but the Führer was one step ahead, and using contacts in the Reichstag ensured the swift removal of the dissenting politician. When Chancellor Brüning handed in his resignation to the ailing President Hindenburg, chaos ensued. On June the 15th, the ban on the Nazi brown shirts was lifted, and violence erupted on the streets on a scale that Germany had never seen before. But this was only the beginning, because by January 1933, when Hitler was finally made Chancellor of Germany, millions rejoiced, although there were those who were less than enthusiastic. General Erich von Ludendorff, one of the great German commanders of the First World War, who'd fought alongside Hitler at the Beer Hall Putsch, sent a telegram to President Hindenburg voicing his concerns. "You have just handed over our sacred German fatherland to one of the greatest demagogues of all time. I prophesy to you, this evil man will plunge our Reich into the abyss and will inflict immeasurable woe on our nation. Future generations will curse you in your grave for this action." As the Reichstag was burnt to the ground and bonfires of books blazed on Goebbels' orders, it seemed Ludendorff was not mistaken. 100 years before Hitler rose to power, a German Jewish poet, Heinrich Heine, had said, "Whenever books are burnt, human beings are destined to burn too." And as the profound writings of Proust, Freud and Hemingway turned to ashes, many feared the worst. Within months of Hitler's coming to power, individual freedom no longer existed, and with his regime of terror led by the dreaded Gestapo, thousands began to flee the fatherland in terror. Even members of Hitler's own party, the Brown Shirts led by Ernst Röhm, were murdered for becoming too independent. Then, when President Hindenburg died on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler added the presidential powers to those he already held as Chancellor, and effectively, Germany became a dictatorship, totally under Hitler's control. A nation which had once boasted fine universities that were among the world's greatest centres of learning and scientific innovation, sacked its professors and exchanged rational thinking for Nazi propaganda. Believe, obey, fight was now taught in schools, as Hitler demanded a brutal, domineering, fearless, cruel youth. The free, splendid beast of prey must once again flash from its eyes. This is how I will eradicate thousands of years of human domestication. That is how I will create the new order. Anyone refusing to conform was sent to the concentration camps, but those who remained to do Hitler's bidding were rewarded. Among the gifted Germans who didn't flee Hitler's regime were the extremely talented Albert Speer, who became the first architect of the Reich, and Leni Riefenstahl, a beautiful actress turned director who recorded the extraordinary Nazi rallies that took place, elevating Hitler to an almost godlike status that also played such a crucial part in Nazi propaganda efforts. Now Hitler had reached an unassailable position in Germany, he could concentrate on his two greatest goals: Lebensraum, finding living space for the German people, and the destruction of the Jews. He rapidly began building the German army and increasing the naval fleet, flagrantly breaking the limitations set after World War I. In a secret conference on November 5th, 1937, he disclosed to his generals plans to invade Poland and go to war with France and Britain. Two senior generals, Werner von Blomberg and Werner von Fritsch, were horrified and spoke out against Hitler. But when the Führer ordered their humiliating removal, he actually alienated traditionalists in the Wehrmacht. By the beginning of 1938, the old generals feared their country would once more be plunged into war, but it was impossible to sway Hitler from the decisions he'd already made. When faced with opposition, he would remove it. On February the 4th, 1938, Hitler abolished the entire war ministry, sacking 16 senior generals, and announced, "From now on, I take over personally the command over the whole armed forces." 44 other generals resigned. So it was that with the German nation and the armed forces under his total control, Hitler prepared for his first move, greedily eyeing up the land of his birth, Austria, but he was unaware there were those who stood in the shadows, ready to thwart his plans. Wilhelm Canaris was a decorated officer, fluent in many languages, who'd been made head of the German High Command Counterintelligence Service in 1935. Canaris had been a major influence on Hitler's decision to side with General Franco during the Spanish Civil War in 1936, which led to the terrible Nazi destruction of the village Guernica, famously recorded in Picasso's painting of the same name. However, Canaris did not remain under Hitler's spell for long, and after witnessing the terrible treatment of Jews and the destruction being wrought by the Third Reich, began his careful opposition to the aggressive new order. As Hitler finalised his plans to occupy Austria, Fearing a war with Britain, Canaris sent a secret emissary to communicate with MI6 in London, presenting his ideas to overthrow the Nazis. Keen to promote peace, however, the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, showed no sign of preparing to take action as the Nazis marched into Austria, and while Hitler's troops began to edge towards Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain met the Nazi leader and Mussolini in Munich to ratify a peace treaty accepting Germany's occupation of a part of Czechoslovakia, on condition that Hitler agreed to halt any further invasions. The German generals who'd plotted against Hitler could do no more than watch in dismay as Britain stood back and appeased the Nazi regime. Chamberlain's error of judgment soon became apparent when Hitler revealed his horrifying plans for his next invasion, as Poland was targeted. As Goering drove his army across the Polish border, obliterating all that stood in his way, reports of mass murder throughout the country filtered back to Canaris. The nobility and clergy were targeted for extermination. Entire villages were wiped out, and Jews burnt to death. Efforts by regular soldiers to prevent brutalities were swept aside by Himmler's Gestapo, and there followed a rapid deterioration in army discipline. Canaris warned General Wilhelm Keitel, the High Commander of the Armed Forces, that the military would be held responsible for the atrocities being committed. But the general responded that he was simply following Hitler's orders. Even so, some years later, just as Canaris had predicted, Keitel was held accountable and executed by the Allies. The situation in Poland forced Neville Chamberlain and the British to go to war with Germany, which was officially declared on September 3rd, 1939.
To withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us.
An eyewitness account noted that there was no joyous celebration in the German capital on the eve of this conflict, unlike the excitement surrounding the First World War, but rather shock and a silent dread hung over the nation. Nevertheless, the revolutionary tactics of the German army would prove astoundingly successful, and despite the entry of Britain into the conflict, quickly followed by France, there was no halting the Nazi advance, and Poland quickly fell, to be carved up between Nazi Germany and Communist Russia before the Allies could act. Denmark and Norway followed, being swiftly occupied by the Nazis, and the Russian leader Joseph Stalin ordered his troops into Finland. And while Hitler made plans to invade Holland and France, the German Old Guard again tried to warn the Allies. Hans Oster, deputy to Canaris, tried to inform the Netherlands military attaché in Berlin more than 20 times of the exact date of the constantly delayed invasion of Holland. But the Dutch government refused to believe him until the paratroopers descended from the skies, by which time it was too late. Finally, there was a glimmer of hope for the conspirators when Winston Churchill, a man who'd famously spoken out against Hitler since the early 1930s, took over from Neville Chamberlain as Prime Minister of Great Britain on May the 10th, 1940. Even so, Churchill had a tough task right from day one, because while he was settling into Downing Street, Hitler's panzer tanks stormed through France, using a sickle-cut manoeuvre to separate Allied troops, trapping thousands of British and French soldiers on the beaches of Dunkirk to face almost certain death in Hitler's well-sprung trap. However, Churchill put in place a daring plan to rescue the stranded Allies, just as Hitler made one of the most extraordinary decisions of the war, calling on his panzer divisions to halt within a matter of kilometres of Dunkirk. Some have suggested the Führer was teaching his generals that he was in charge and not to be questioned whatever he did, while others believe that Hitler intended a gesture of goodwill as he still hoped to negotiate a peace treaty with the British. Conversely, it may simply have been arrogance on Hitler's part, believing he had all the time in the world. But Churchill, right from the moment of his arrival at Number 10, gave notice that he was not to be underestimated. In just the few days of respite given by Hitler's delay in finishing the task at hand, Churchill's Operation Dynamo, complete with a fleet of civilian craft, rescued more than 300,000 Allied troops from the beaches of Dunkirk. Despite the fact that so many Allied soldiers had escaped to fight another day, Hitler was undeterred and quickly advanced to take Paris, celebrating his victory over the French. Revenge being sweet, Hitler ordered that the very carriage where France and Germany had signed the armistice in 1918 be removed from its museum and placed in the exact same spot in the forest of Compiègne where it had stood on that fateful day. Hitler wanted to sit triumphantly in the seat that the French General Foch had 20 years earlier, accepting the German surrender. This time, however, it would be the French generals who would bow to Hitler and Nazi Germany. France was now under Nazi control, and as Hitler turned his gaze to Britain, a nation standing alone against Germany across the English Channel, he decided it was time to invade the United Kingdom. Hitler quickly presented plans to destroy the British Royal Air Force before attempting a landing as part of Operation Sea Lion, and in the summer of 1940, Goering led the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. But again, Hitler underestimated his enemy, not only the brave pilots prepared to give their lives in the fight for freedom, but also the nation's people, who were determined that Hitler and his cruel regime would never set foot on British soil. What's more, Hitler got something of a shock when on August the 25th, 1940, the RAF bombed Berlin. Goering had assured the German people this could never happen, and although causing little damage, it shook the confidence of the Berliners and lowered morale considerably. Hitler was furious and let his anger colour his judgment when he sought revenge by bombing London and other major cities day and night, rather than continuing to target the airfields of southeast England. The RAF were totally exhausted and on their knees by the end of August 1940, and had the Germans continued targeting the RAF, victory was within their grasp. Because of the bombing of Britain's cities, the Air Force had time to recover, and the Nazis lost their advantage before even realising they'd had it. The British morale held strong, and people continued to doggedly brew their pots of tea amongst crumbling buildings and in bomb shelters, spurred on by the stirring words of Winston Churchill, unwavering in their determination to defend their island. As Erwin Rommel, Hitler's favourite general, was sent to defeat the British in North Africa, he boasted many victories, much to Hitler's delight. But Britain's spirit remained unbreakable, and by spring 1941, the threat of a full-scale invasion was less and less likely, especially as by now Hitler had a more pressing engagement, opening up an eastern front to attack the Russians, something he'd always intended to do, disregarding the non-aggression pact with Stalin. This was perhaps the most important invasion of Hitler's military career, and one he had waited for impatiently. Along with the Jews, Hitler detested the Soviets and had told Goebbels his main aim was to finally eliminate the Bolshevik poison from Europe. On June the 22nd, 1941, Hitler's troops marched into the Soviet Union along a 1,800-mile front. Only 3 days before Operation Barbarossa was set in motion, the Führer had given specific orders that the campaign should be waged with extreme brutality. Himmler had instructed the security forces to act against all populations who were potentially anti-German or racially inferior, by shooting indiscriminately at men, burning villages to the ground, and deporting women and children to the concentration camps. But despite the Russian people being abused so viciously, by October, when torrents of rain fell, turning the roads and battlefields into mud swamps before the onset of a bitter winter, the Russian weather was able to dash Hitler's hopes of a swift occupation. Hitler had promised that when it came to Russia, the Nazis would have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. But he was mistaken. He had guaranteed Germany a victory within 6 months. But as more of his troops were killed or wounded, even Goebbels' propaganda machine could do little to hide the fact that all was not going to plan. Many began to despair, and even Germany's greatest heroes lost hope. Germany's first airman, Ernst Udet, frustrated by Goering's lies about the lack of raw material to build more planes, was plunged into a deep depression over the war with Russia and committed suicide. And it wasn't long before Hitler had a great deal more to worry about than losing ground to Stalin's Red Army. On December the 7th, 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, an act that would at long last bring America into the conflict. And just 4 days later, Hitler declared war on America. The Axis powers now faced a coalition that included the world's largest empire, the world's greatest industrial and financial power, and the world's largest army, namely Great Britain, the United States of America, and Russia. Those who had for so long supported Hitler were now beginning to fear the worst, and along with field marshals, generals, diplomats and senior officials, the German resistance gathered momentum. Among them was Colonel Henning von Tresckow, who'd been working on a plot to assassinate Hitler after hearing the Führer's speech on the War of Annihilation against the Soviet Union. So it was that on March the 13th, 1943, von Tresckow gave a case containing 2 bottles of cognac to a member of Hitler's staff, which had a bomb concealed within it as Hitler flew to the Eastern Front. Frustratingly, the bomb failed to detonate, and a week later another attempt was made when a close friend of von Tresckow went to meet Hitler on Unter den Linden in Berlin, with his pockets filled with explosives. He came close to being history's first suicide bomber, but Hitler left before the bomb went off, and the explosives had to be defused as quickly as possible. While von Tresckow waited for another opportunity, it was obvious that not only military personnel were trying to resist the Nazis. A group of working-class teenagers calling themselves the Edelweiss Pirates pitted their wits against Hitler's Nazi youth, regularly stuffing Allied leaflets into letterboxes and using slogans and songs which were more poignant than they could ever have known. Hitler's power may lay us low and keep us locked in chains, but we will smash the chains one day. We'll be free again. But such was the sense of paranoia amongst Hitler's henchmen that even gangs of 16-year-olds were considered a threat by the Gestapo, and many of the Edelweiss pirates were brutally executed. Worse was to come for the German people, when in November 1943 the Allies increased their attacks, targeting the capital Berlin with a fierce bombardment on the scale faced by London during the Blitz. Many national monuments were obliterated, and it was clear that Hitler's war, started with such a flourish, was now turning in favour of the Allies. Goebbels did what he could through propaganda, conjuring up images of a nation under siege as he spoke to the public, rallying the Germans to defend the fatherland. But as Berlin was laid to waste, it became ever clearer to the rebels that the only way to end the war was to kill Hitler. As Mussolini was arrested in Italy and the Italians turned against Germany, the members of the resistance hoped they too might remove their leader, and with a new and very valuable addition to their ranks by the name of Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg, who'd returned wounded from the fighting in North Africa, the plans to assassinate Hitler received a huge boost. As a military man, von Stauffenberg had admired Hitler's strong leadership when he came to power. However, soon the model soldier was disgusted by the atrocities being committed, and when approached by General Friedrich Olbricht, a central figure in the resistance against Nazism, he immediately agreed to take part in a coup against the Führer. In June 1944, the Allies were closing in. The Soviets had cleared the Nazis from Russia and were heading towards Germany, and the D-Day landings along the beaches of Normandy were well underway, so the resistance knew they had to act quickly. On July 1st, 1944, von Stauffenberg was appointed Chief of Staff to the Army Reserve in Berlin, putting him in regular contact with Hitler. It was the perfect opportunity. Twice he arrived at conferences carrying briefcases containing explosives, but twice he had to abort his mission as Himmler wasn't present. Finally, on the 20th of July 1944, von Stauffenberg carried out Operation Valkyrie and took a briefcase containing a bomb to a meeting at Hitler's war headquarters in East Prussia. After half an hour, he made his excuses and departed, leaving the briefcase beneath the table. Hearing the bomb explode from outside the building, he was convinced Hitler would be dead and flew immediately back to Berlin to organise the coup. However, when von Stauffenberg had left the room, an officer sitting near the briefcase had moved it further beneath the table, and the blast, although killing some, was minimised by the solid oak table. As realisation dawned that Hitler had only been slightly injured, the resistance were horrified and knew their fate was sealed. When von Stauffenberg returned to the army headquarters, where his compatriots stood poised to take on the Nazis, he was captured and executed, along with Olbricht and many others. Thousands more were arrested in connection with the assassination attempt, and today a memorial now stands where Stauffenberg bravely uttered his last words, "Long live Holy Germany." With the failure of the assassination attempt, the Second World War would continue for another year, claiming many more lives, but the Third Reich's days were numbered. Berlin was left virtually unprotected as the Red Army speedily advanced towards Hitler's headquarters from the east, while the Americans marched in from the west. On the 20th of April, 1945, Hitler's birthday, the Soviet artillery began to shell the centre of Berlin. But the Nazis had forbidden civilians to leave the city in a bid to boost military morale, and some were even shot by their own countrymen for putting white flags outside their houses. Goebbels' propaganda slogans had been scrawled on any buildings left standing. "Every German will defend his capital. We shall stop the red hordes at the walls of our Berlin." But now terrified by the approaching Red Army, already renowned for its own atrocities in Poland, many Berliners began to flee. In the rubble that had once been the proud, beautiful German capital, Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich had crumbled into oblivion. As elderly men and youths were employed to defend the city, fighting a hopeless battle, Hitler and Goebbels hid beneath the city in a bunker under the Reich Chancellery, along with Eva Braun, Goebbels' wife and children, and other Nazi officials. On April the 28th, 1945, Hitler heard the news that Himmler, his most loyal commander, had contacted the Allies to negotiate a surrender. Hitler exploded in a rage and even at this late hour sought someone to blame, executing one of the commanders in the bunker. Later that night, Hitler married Eva Braun before dictating his last political testament, which claimed the war would one day go down in history as the most glorious and heroic manifestation of a people's will to live. But Hitler's ultimate demise was far from glorious, and on April the 30th, 1945, having heard that Berlin was on the verge of collapse, he and his new bride bit into vials of cyanide, and perhaps fearing that even this would not kill him, Hitler shot himself in the head. Only 2 days later, the Red Army found their charred remains in the Reich Chancellery garden, along with the bodies of Goebbels and his family, who had also taken poison. Goering and Himmler were captured, and at the Nuremberg trials were condemned to death, but they committed suicide before the sentence could be carried out. And while the men who had led them into the abyss were now free from retribution, the people of Germany were left to face the consequences. Control of Germany was split between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, and as the prisoners were freed from the concentration camps, the task of rebuilding what had once been such a proud nation began. During the years of the Nazi regime, there were no less than 44 attempts on Adolf Hitler's life. But as he cheated death again and again, millions of innocent souls would perish. Today, Germany's capital, Berlin, has been rebuilt, and a spirit of hope and reconciliation has replaced the Nazi ideology. But if you look carefully, the scars still remain to remind those who come here of the reign of one of the world's most terrible dictators, warning mankind for all eternity that absolute power corrupts absolutely.